Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am your host, Scott Allen, and this is Phronesis, Practical Wisdom for Leaders. If the topic is leadership, I'm in. I've spent more than 20 years in the field teaching, learning, writing, and questioning. When I'm not working on Phronesis, I travel, delivering keynotes, working with individuals and teams, and helping people from organizations across industries become better leaders. Want to learn more? Visit me at scottjallen.net. Phronesis offers a smart, fast-paced discussion about all things leadership. We explore relevant topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. Listen Notes lists Phronesis in the top 3% of podcasts worldwide. Phronesis is the official podcast of the International Leadership Association. ILA brings together those who teach, study, and develop leadership, advancing leadership knowledge and practice for a better world. Learn more at ila-net.org. Finally, if you enjoy Phronesis, please subscribe to stay current on our weekly episodes. If you find an episode that resonates, please share it with your colleagues and friends. And if you want more content, subscribe to my newsletter, The Leader's Edge. The link is in the show notes. As always, thanks for listening. And now, here's today's show.
Okay, everybody, welcome to Practical Wisdom for Leaders. Thank you so much for checking in wherever you are in the world. We have a returning guest. It's an annual thing now, and I think we're going to continue that because he's going to continue being so incredibly, insanely productive, but not in Virginia any longer. We have breaking news on the podcast. Jonathan White is moving to Texas. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us. Tell us a little bit about your future adventures here, and then we'll jump into the topic for today.
Thank you so much for having me back. I have been at Christopher Newport University for 17 years. I've been part of the Department of Leadership and American Studies. It's been a wonderful run. I started as a postdoctoral fellow, actually, so they offered to make me tenure track. And you know as well as I do, when that offer comes, you take it. And so I've had a great run here, but I was offered a position at the new School of Civic Leadership at the University of Texas. So I am busily packing up my office and my home, and we'll be moving in the second week of June down to Austin. So it's going to be an exciting opportunity.
Now, you just made me think. How many Lincoln artifacts do you have to move to Texas?
Oh, man. So I should say I don't have any really original Lincolns. I don't quite get paid enough for that, but I've got a lot of tchotchkes. I got a lot of sort of squishy heads, so stress things that you can squeeze, and bookends, and I don't know, maybe 2,000, 3,000 books that I've got to move. So that's the hardest part, I think, is moving the books. I was thinking about it. So I love collecting historical wine bottles, and I collect the Federalist wine. And so I've got bottles of Hamilton, Washington, Ben Franklin, and of course, Lincoln. And part of me was thinking, I wonder if I really need to move these, or maybe I can just buy new ones and drink them down in Texas and save myself having to move them. So I just Googled before we got on this call, can I buy Federalist wine in Texas? And it turns out I can. So I haven't decided if I'm going to move them or not. The biggest Lincoln thing I have, I won the Lincoln Prize in 2023, and that comes with a 100-pound Lincoln bust. So that's going to be riding on the front seat of my minivan next to me. I'm not going to trust that one in the moving truck.
It's in front row. Kids in the back, bust in the front seat.
Kids in the back, bust in the front. Or if the kids are in the other car, then that way I figure I can ride HOV.
Okay, so speaking of books, you've added another one, and so I'm excited for this conversation. There's a scholar named Brad Jackson. He's in New Zealand, and he's been on the podcast for listeners. Just look up the episode with Brad Jackson. But he really writes a lot about leadership and place and the importance of place in leadership and in an individual's leadership. We know that, and so, of course, when he's looking at it from a context of a New Zealander, place is very important, and the history of that place and the environment that these people grew up in. And so I'm excited for this conversation because you're adding a new dimension to the dialogue we've been having. For listeners, you can just Google up other episodes with Jonathan. It's been a really fun run of episodes. But you've written about place. And so I'm excited to hear a couple thoughts that you have about your exploration of this topic.
Yeah, so when we think about Abraham Lincoln, it's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it until you were just saying it. I imagine most people, if their minds were to think about Lincoln and place, their minds would probably go to a place that Lincoln never saw, never went, and that would be the Lincoln Memorial.
Oh, wow.
Where we envision this giant temple with this giant statue, and that's how we associate often place with Lincoln. One of my favorite places associated with Lincoln is a place he spent a lot of time, and that was his home in Springfield. And in the Lincoln Memorial, you see the public Lincoln. You see this larger-than-life icon. In Springfield, you see the private Lincoln. You see the Lincoln who is rising into the upper middle class and becoming a politician of national renown. And my favorite place is Lincoln's home. It's the only house he ever owned. He lived there for 17 years, minus when he was in Congress in the late 1840s. But for much of his adult life, this was where he lived. And it's a place where when you go into the Lincoln home, you can almost imagine the private man. He's not this figure who is dealing with national problems. He's thinking about those things, but he's the father, he's the husband, he's the local lawyer, he is the customer who has businessmen coming over selling him things, or selling things to his wife, maybe would be the more appropriate way to think about it. And it gives us, I think, a real person. And that's something that the Lincoln Memorial often doesn't give us. When we go there, we don't think about Lincoln as a real person. He's almost like godlike in his stature. But when you go to the Lincoln home, you see the real man. So I've been going to Springfield for years, and every summer I actually teach a group of high school teachers through the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And we bring in teachers from around the country, and we spend a week just talking about Abraham Lincoln, and I teach them how to teach Lincoln to their students. But then we also go to all the sites, and my favorite one to go to is the Lincoln home. And as I was there a year ago, I thought there's no really good book about the Lincoln home. And so I talked to the staff there, and then I approached the history press about it. They've got this wonderful Images of America series where you basically pull together 150, 200 photographs, and you tell the story of a place through photos and short captions. And everyone loved the idea. And so I ended up writing it last year, and it was a real joy. And I learned a lot about Lincoln in the process.
Now, Jonathan, do they know you at the Lincoln home? The people
They do. I've gotten to know the gift shop manager very well. She carries a lot of my books, and whenever I'm in town, she has me do a signing. And it's great because whenever my students go to Springfield or friends go to Springfield, they go to the Lincoln home and they'll always send me a selfie. They'll be like, "Here I am with your book." And then I write back and I'm like, "But did you buy it?" That's what I need.
That's what I need. Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. Okay. So I'm interested in hearing 2 or 3 things that stood out for you. What did you learn that in this process that really stood out? I'm excited to hear what those are.
Yeah, this is a place where Lincoln grew a lot as an adult and where he struggled. So he didn't always have the happiest marriage, which I think is very well known among general readers who read about the Lincoln marriage or who read about the Lincolns. It's actually a very hotly contested thing about, did they love each other? Did they hate each other? What were the dynamics? My view is, in a lot of ways, we'll never really know what went on behind closed doors in that case. But we also see Lincoln, the father, here. And this is one of the things that's really interesting to me. So Lincoln had a terrible relationship with his father. His father was a strict disciplinarian. His father didn't value education and didn't value Lincoln getting an education. His father was just a hardworking, plodding man. And Lincoln wanted something better for himself. He wanted to self-educate. He wanted to use his mind instead of his hands to work and to make something bigger than just a farmer or a cabinet maker like his father was.
Wow.
And in fact, when Lincoln's father died, Lincoln didn't go to see him one last time before he died. It would have been a short journey. He was in Illinois, but Lincoln wrote a letter to his stepbrother saying basically, it'd be better for all of us if I didn't go see Dad before he dies.
Wow.
Like, that's how estranged they were.
Okay.
And Lincoln had a big reaction as a parent then, as the leader of his home in a sense, or of his children. in that he was not strict at all. So whereas Lincoln was very harshly punished as a child, he never disciplined his children. He
Okay.
let them run around and create all sorts of havoc. And there's all these stories about what their home was like, the noise and the mess. Lincoln's law partner, I don't know, can I say a curse that is true to the record?
Yeah.
So Lincoln's law partner said that if Lincoln's boys had shit on the table and on his hat and rubbed it on his boots or something, that Lincoln would have laughed and called it smart. And here's a fascinating side of Lincoln that I don't think we normally think about. Because he had been raised in such a strict home, he had a complete reaction to that and raised his kids without any real discipline. And in fact, one of his sons, Tad, didn't learn how to read till he was 13 or 11, and which is incredible to think about because Lincoln valued education so much. And yet he didn't force his one son to learn how to read. And it's a pretty remarkable thing. That's something that you can kind of get a sense of when you're in the house and you see the toys and you see the things that the children would have played with. And they actually do have some of the original toys that belong to the Lincoln boys that are still there to see.
Wow. Okay. So Lincoln the father, interesting. I didn't know any of that. And so that had a big impact on him, his relationship with his father. And yeah, to your point, it sounds like there's just this kind of pendulum swing almost to the extreme of the other side.
Yeah. Yeah, when they got to the White House, actually, Willie and Tad, his two youngest sons, surviving sons, they would ride goats through the White House. And you'd have all these people, these women in hoop skirts and these men in suits, and they're walking around the White House there to see the president. And here come the two boys riding. They would hitch up chairs to the goats, prod the goats, and they'd go running through while they're riding on chairs. And it's not what you think of when you think about Abraham Lincoln.
Wow. Now, how did Mary parent then? Was she similar?
Mary was much stricter. And so there are stories that I tell in the book where Mary is very strict and Lincoln would come in and try to there's a story that I tell in the book where Mary had given a dime to her son Tad, and Tad was supposed to go to the store to buy something and he lost it. And Mary just starts yelling at him, "You're a thief, you stole this dime." And Abraham comes in and says, "What's going on?" And Mary tries to explain, and Tad says, "I didn't steal it, I promise." And Lincoln picks him up and pulls out his pocket, and it turns out the dime had just gotten stuck in the seam of his pocket, and so he wasn't a thief. But yeah, there are stories that survive about Mary being very strict or Mary being a very anxious parent. On one occasion, their oldest son, Robert, had gotten into the lime box out by the outhouse, and it was in his mouth. And Mary was screaming, "Robert will die, Robert will die." And so a neighbor heard it and came over and cleaned out his mouth and said he's going to be fine. So Abraham was a very lax parent. Mary was the exact opposite.
Wow. Okay, couple other things. What else stood out for you in the research for this book?
Yeah, this is a place where Lincoln does take a step towards his greatest achievement, becoming president. And this was something that was really interesting to me. In 1860, he wins the Republican nomination for president. And the thing is, nobody expected him to win. He was a nobody. He wasn't well known outside of Illinois. And so in 1860, there were a bunch of front runners, and they all convened on Chicago for the Republican National Convention. And the thing was, in those days, when delegates got to the convention, nobody knew who was going to win. Today, when you hold a convention, everyone knows who the nominee is going to be. But in those days, the delegates would show up and they were pledged to vote for one candidate. And they had to vote for that candidate on the first ticket. But then after that, they could change their vote. So the front runner was a guy from New York named William Seward, who was a very famous senator. And Seward's men were so confident that he was going to win the nomination that they all went out and got drunk, and they were partying the night before the big vote. Lincoln's men showed up at the convention, and they went to the delegates for all the other front runners and said, "Hey, if your guy doesn't win, how about you consider Abraham Lincoln as your second choice?" And so Seward's guys are drinking and Lincoln's guys are working hard. And the next day, and there's a lot that goes on that I won't tell you, but the next day, Seward wins the most votes on the first ballot, but not enough to get a majority to win the nomination. And Lincoln is way down on the bottom. The second vote, Seward picks up a few delegates, but Lincoln jumps way high. And on the third vote, Lincoln overtakes Seward.
Wow.
And so you have this situation where a guy nobody's ever heard of is now the nominee for a major political party. And a telegram is sent back to Springfield, and Lincoln finds out that he's won the nomination. And they've got to get the House ready because all the leaders, or a lot of the leaders of the Republican Party, are going to come down and formally tender him the nomination.
So he's not even there. He's not even at the...
No, he's not even at the convention. Yeah, that's right. In those days, in the Civil War era and before, the leader of the party, the guy who wins the nomination, is not going to be there. And in fact, if you think about the terminology, today we say that candidates run for office. In those days, a candidate stood for office.
Wow.
Because it was beneath the dignity of a leader to go out and pander for votes. You let other people do that for you, but if you were running for president, you wouldn't be out there giving speeches. There's a very famous Tippecanoe and Tyler II race in 1840 where William Henry Harrison just kind of hangs out in his log cabin. And if people want to come talk to him, they can, but otherwise he's not out there campaigning. Very different way of becoming president than we have today. And so Lincoln is back in Springfield, a couple hours south of Chicago. And they find out that he's won. He got a telegram. And so they start to set up for a reception. And I knew the sort of outlines of this story, but I didn't know the details of it. And Mary is kind of setting up for this fancy reception, and they set out alcohol. And somebody says to her, some of these guys are teetotalers. They don't drink. Maybe we shouldn't have alcohol. And Abraham has to convince her to put it away. And when the delegation shows up, they see Lincoln's boys just kind of sitting out on the front step, and there's two little hooligans who are mischief makers, and they talk to the boys a little bit, and then they come into the parlor. And so for the listeners, if you ever go to the Lincoln home, you go in the front door, and on the left is a huge room. It's a double parlor, and that's where they greet Lincoln. This is the first time that these men ever see him or ever meet him, and they don't know what he is. They don't know who he is. They know he's famous for splitting rails, like splitting logs, and they know he's a self-taught politician and lawyer, but they don't have very high expectations of him. And so they go in and they make a few speeches to him, and then he responds with a short speech. And afterwards, a number of these delegates wrote about the meeting, and a few of them were still not impressed by Lincoln, but most of them, I think, were taken in by just how smart they could tell he was, how articulate he was. One of them, a guy from Pennsylvania, was very short and made a joke about now Pennsylvania looks up to Illinois because Illinois had this tall 6'4" nominee. And so it's this great moment where, again, you can walk in the parlor, you can stand in the very spot where this meeting happened, where Lincoln essentially accepted the nomination to run for president. And that's a spot where he's beginning to shape the way people think about him, because he knows interacting with these leaders, they're going to go out to their communities and talk about what he's like, and it's going to begin to radiate his image outward.
Wow. And so I had no clue that's how that worked. And so it then becomes an epicenter for his rise, that location.
That's right. And again, this was something I never knew until I was researching the book. So newspaper correspondents from around the country, from New York to California, converge on Springfield. And because they know their readers want to know, who is this guy? What does he look like? What does he sound like? Many of them are writing about his home, and they're like, it's a very modest 2-story home that he lives in. Some of the journalists are allowed to just go in and hang out in the house while other politicians are coming to meet with him and talk to him. So these were a lot of my sources, were these very in-depth journalistic articles where these correspondents come in and just describe every little detail, the pictures that are on the wall, the things that are on the shelves, the books that are there, the law books, the behavior of his boys or of his wife. And so you get all these really wonderful firsthand accounts, and it's people at the time letting the country know, who is this guy? There's no Twitter that Abraham Lincoln can go out on. There's no real bully pulpit like TR would have to be able to get his message out there. And so it's going to be mediated through these journalists.
Wow. Okay. How about one or two more things that stood out?
Yeah. One thing about Lincoln that I love is his ability to deliver speeches. I think he's one of the greatest orators we've ever had. And so when
Yes.
you go into his bedroom, you can see the desk that he probably wrote the House Divided address on, which was one of his most important speeches in 1858. The story behind that desk, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it's a story that does survive. Mary apparently threw out the desk. And then Lincoln apparently trash picked it to save it, which is great because now it's still in the house and you can see the desk where he wrote at least one, if not more, of his speeches. But then there's this touching moment as he's leaving Springfield. And again, he's been in Springfield since about 1837. It's now 1861. He's getting ready to board a train and head to Washington. And his whole community comes out. And these are the shopkeepers that he knew. These are the law clients. These are the children that he played with. These are the servants who worked in his home. And they all gather around as he's about to board the train. And the station is still there. It's been modified a bit, but it's still there. And he gives a very short impromptu speech where he talks about, this is where I came here as a young man. I'm now leaving as an old man, not knowing whether or ever I'll ever return. He talks about how his 4 boys were born there and one of them is buried. He's heading to Washington, D.C., he says, with a task upon him greater than that which faced George Washington. And he concluded by asking for the prayers of his neighbors and his friends as he embarked on this journey. It's a really incredible speech. And I've done a lot of work on Lincoln over the years, and I have found letters where during the Civil War, people write to him and they say, when you gave that last little speech before leaving Springfield, you asked for prayer and we're praying for you. We're praying for your leadership during the Civil War, that you'll lead us through this horrific event and reunite the nation. And that's where I think you see Lincoln as the man and the politician wrapped into one. You see him giving a message of hope and optimism that he's going to be able to accomplish this, but he's also connecting in a very personal way. And when I think about Lincoln as a leader, I think if I were to think about the one word that really comes to mind, and I think I've used this word before in previous conversations that we have, it would be authenticity.
Yeah.
We look at so many modern politicians today, and they're so inauthentic. They poll test things before they put it out on social media. They want to know what's the reaction going to be, and they won't do anything that's not perfectly calculated.
Yep.
And that wasn't Lincoln. The Lincoln that you see in his home is the real guy. That's the same Lincoln that you get in public who speaks honestly to you. That's why we call him Honest Abe. It's the same guy who would do things that were not politically advantageous. We had a conversation a few years ago about my book, A House Built by Slaves, where Lincoln is out there in Washington, D.C., shaking the hands of Black men and women, which a politician in that era never would have done. But he was an authentic guy, and he greeted people with dignity and respect. And so you see that in Lincoln in Springfield, and he takes that with him to Washington, D.C. And it's a pretty refreshing thing, I think, to see that side of Lincoln.
Now, for the time, is this home impressive? Is it average? What impression would people have gotten when they embarked on this nominee's homestead, right?
So when he bought it, it was a 1.5-story home.
Okay.
And at various points, he did some improvements on it, and he raised it up to be 2 full stories. So when you go there today, it's the full 2-story home, which is what it looked like when he left for Washington in 1861. I think it's a beautiful home, and I've often fantasized about if I ever bought a plot of land and built my own home, like I would love to redesign it and live in something like that. But it's funny, when a lot of these journalists came to Springfield in 1860 and 61, they kind of mocked it. They're like, yeah, it's okay for a Western lawyer. They weren't terribly complimentary of it. One journalist compared it to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's home. So if any of your listeners know that house in Cambridge, which is another one of my favorite houses to visit, there are some similarities, but I think Longfellow's house is probably a little bit bigger. But generally speaking, it was a very modest home, and he didn't really make it big in law until the 1850s, where he was getting some really huge fees. So for most of his life, he lived a pretty modest life.
Yeah. Yeah.
But think about like where he rose from. The guy was born in a log cabin with no wood floor, no windows, no glass in the windows, no door in the door frame. Pretty incredible to think about how he rose. And actually the first chapter traces the various places he lived from birth until he moved into this house and shows the people he boarded with. He was living in poverty for much of his life. When he was a guy in his 20s, he couldn't afford his own place, so he had to rent half a bed from another guy like that above a store. That's how he had to live.
Half a bed.
Yeah. It was not uncommon back then for male strangers to share beds in hotels or living like that. So he came into a store in Springfield. The store is no longer there, but it faced the town square where the old state capitol is. And he went in and he said to the guy, "How much is a mattress? I need to buy a bed." And the guy told him the price and he couldn't really afford it. And the guy said, "I have a bed upstairs. If you want to pay rent, you can share it with me." And Lincoln took his stuff upstairs, looked around, dropped off his saddlebags, came back downstairs. The guy's name was Joshua Speed. And he said, "Speed, I've moved." And they ended up living together for years and becoming very good friends for the rest of their lives.
Speed, I've moved.
And again, that's not the Abraham Lincoln we would think of.
No.
But when he was down on his luck and poor, that's how he had to get by.
Any other sense of like how just Springfield as a community, I think it's a beautiful story of when he left. Good, bad, and different. How did Springfield shape him? And maybe we'll kind of conclude there.
Sure. I think this is where he honed his political skills. And he started in politics as a very sarcastic kind of guy where he would say things that today might make people blush. He would write kind of scurrilous newspaper editorials making fun of people. And after a while, he really matured, and he matured into a statesman. And so I think that's a maturation that takes place as a result of the experiences he has in Springfield. And the Lincoln we know today, the great orator, the guy who's able to transcend boundaries for us today, like everyone today can claim Lincoln as their representative in a way. But that was not the Lincoln who moved to Springfield. And Lincoln almost got involved in a duel at one point because of some scurrilous things he had written. And the guy who challenged him, when you were challenged, you got to pick the terms of the duel. And so the guy who challenged him was a very good marksman and Lincoln was not. And the guy who challenged him was very short and Lincoln was tall. So when this guy, James Shields, challenged Lincoln to a duel, Lincoln said, "Okay, we'll do the duel, but the rules are we stand in a square and there's a line dividing the square into halves. And if you step on the line, you automatically forfeit your life. And we're going to use broadswords to hack at each other until one of us is dead." And that got James Shields to think, I was expecting guns. I wasn't expecting swords. And Lincoln's got long arms and he's really big. Maybe honor's been met. We don't need to have the duel after all. But those are experiences he had as a young politician that after that, Lincoln was horrified that he had written what he wrote. And he never wanted to talk about that duel. He was ashamed of it. In fact, during his presidency, someone asked him about it at the White House, and Lincoln said something like, "If you want to be a friend of mine, you'll never ask me about that again." And so that's, I think about the way Lincoln changed and grew in that town. It's a fundamental part of the story that often gets left out of the Lincoln story because we usually just think about Lincoln, the president, but he had a lot of really incredible experiences that led him to that place.
Yeah. And it was probably in an interesting way, push back on this if you disagree or if it's inaccurate, but did it provide him the space to do that growing, to become that person in a different way than maybe had he been elsewhere? He'd been in New York City or Chicago, for instance. It almost feels like it created space for him to do that deep work, both as in maturity, but also probably in his understanding and studies. He's also probably a little more in tune with even what rural Americans are experiencing than maybe some others.
It's funny, before he lived in Springfield, he lived in a town called New Salem, and he lived there from 1831 to 37. New Salem was created in 1829, and by about 1840, the little boom town had completely been abandoned. It was a ghost town. And so to your point, there are scholars who say it's like New Salem was there for the 10-year period that Lincoln needed it to start his adult journey. And then Springfield becomes that next place where he grows in exactly the way you're describing. And yeah, Central Illinois, the way a lawyer would work is he would ride the circuit. So he would go around all the counties in Central Illinois and hear cases from people. So basically, all the lawyers and a judge show up in the county seat, and all the people with cases come out, and they find a lawyer, and then they argue the cases, and then the lawyers and the judge move on. And Lincoln being in that world enabled him to connect with a lot of people from a lot of walks of life.
Yeah.
And actually, it makes me think of Frederick Douglass in that there are a lot of people who criticize Lincoln for having grown up in poverty, and they're like, W.E.B. Du Bois was very derogatory towards Lincoln for having grown up in poverty. Douglass saw it very differently. Douglass saw Lincoln's ability to connect with people as an outgrowth of his upbringing. And in fact, Douglass saw Lincoln's politics of being able to persuade by starting with a small goal and then eventually getting to a larger goal as a result of learning how to split rails. Like Douglass said that Lincoln's politics was like splitting rails. First, you put in the narrow edge of a wedge and you hammer it in until eventually the thick edge is in and you get what you want. And that's an incredible leadership principle.
Yeah.
Because so many politicians like, I've got this big goal and I got to get it now. And it's really hard to bring your followers over to be where you're at. Whereas Lincoln understood, you start with something that everyone can agree on, and you start there, and then you eventually push and persuade until you get the bigger goal that you want. And on Black suffrage, that was the example that Douglass was talking about. Lincoln initially talked about only giving the right to vote to Black men who had either served in the military or were educated. And some people criticize Lincoln. They're like, oh, but there's no restrictions on white male voting. Why would you put a restriction here? And Douglass wasn't bothered. From his perspective, he knew, as Lincoln knew, if you started by a common point of, okay, Black men who have served in the army of all men deserve the right to vote, surely they should have it. You start there, you eventually get to universal Black manhood suffrage, which is what happened. Lincoln learned that in the country.
Change, you can kind of flood and provide the sweeping broad vision, and it shocks the system. It takes us out of homeostasis. Or to your point, I love that. Yeah, you might have the larger vision in mind, but where do you start? And I love how you phrase that. Is it a place of commonality that, generally speaking, this isn't going to be too controversial, and you start opening the door to the conversation versus everything shutting down right away? Love it.
There's a very famous quote that Lincoln did in one of the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1858, where he said, and I'm going to butcher the quote a bit, but he said, "Public sentiment is everything. He who shapes public sentiment goes deeper than he who enacts statutes or makes pronouncements. He makes statutes possible." In other words, he says possible or impossible to be executed, I think. In other words, if you have raw power, you can force something through. But if you don't bring the people along with you, it's going to be really hard to actually make it part of the culture or the law. And Lincoln's view was you've got to first persuade people of what you think. And once you've done that as a leader, then you'll bring them along to get them to the goal you want to be at. And that's another thing I think you really see in Lincoln and Springfield is that logic and reason are central to who he is. He believes that persuasiveness is the most important thing, I think, for a leader to do to be able to accomplish his or her goals.
Okay, I'm closing down the podcast a little bit differently these days. And so what's the practical wisdom in this conversation? How do you think about that question? What's the practical wisdom for listeners?
I think the practical wisdom, in a sense, is something that we haven't even talked about. A lot of times when we look at leaders or public figures, we don't think about them as real people.
Yeah.
This is especially true in our online age, where it's so easy to go on social media and write something you would never say to a person.
Yeah.
But because it's online, it's like I could say something horrific, and usually without consequence. And we forget that in our politics and in our workplaces and in our sports, that these are real human beings. And so I think that as we think about how we engage with one another and how we respond to leaders in different fields or different worlds in which we operate or in which we view online or on television, that we would do well to remember that they're people. That, I think, can give us a sense of charity where we can try to be understanding or try to at least understand where they're coming from. And that's something I think Lincoln was masterful at. And that's something that I think I often think about when I think about this book, because it gives me Lincoln the man, not Lincoln the marble icon.
Yep.
And it enables me. I think we should have charity for people in our own lives and in our world and even historical figures. We can criticize, and we should, where criticism is warranted, but we should also try to have understanding.
Yep.
And I think that comes out in this book in a way.
Always love our conversations. Just love your command of the space, sir, as always. I'm going to butcher this quote, and then you get it almost exactly from 18.
I've already packed up my book,
speech.
so I couldn't pull it off the shelf.
Oh, best of luck as you make this transition. We'll do it again next summer. It's an annual summer thing now, but always love our conversations and just really appreciate you, sir. Best of luck in your new adventures. Thank you.
Thank you.
You have just finished another episode of Practical Wisdom for Leaders with Scott Allen. To contact me, visit scottjallen.net or send me a note at scott@scottjallen.net. I'm also on LinkedIn, so let's connect. If you have feedback, I'd love to hear it. And as always, thank you so much for listening. And now here's my daughter, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.